London, February 1983. A cold morning settles over Muswell Hill, the kind of gray that makes a street look honest. At 23 Cranley Gardens, a plumber kneels beside a stubborn drain and lifts the iron cover. What pushes back at him is not water or grease, but something pale and fibrous, a texture that clings to the air with a smell he will never forget. He stares, certain for a moment that his mind is inventing what his hands have touched. Then he calls his supervisor. The men agree to return at first light. By the time they do, the blockage has been mysteriously cleared away. The truth, however, has already surfaced. Please step into the hallway of a tidy upper floor flat. The tenant opens the door without fuss. He is polite, composed, in the way a civil servant might be when interrupted at home. His name is Dennis Nilsen. He answers questions evenly, as if he has rehearsed them alone in the kitchen, as if this is the inevitable end of a long conversation he has been having with himself. When the officers ask what they will find, he does not run. He does not bargain. He simply says, in a voice so calm it sounds almost tired, that there are bodies, and that there have been more than one. He estimates 15. The number hangs in the room like a draft that won't leave. What follows inside that flat is a catalog of small, ordinary details that become unbearable under fluorescent light. A tea chest that should hold linens, a bathroom that should hold steam, a kitchen that should smell only of frying onions. The officers trace the source of the building's nightmare to the pipes where flesh has been forced to become waste, to a toilet that has been made into a tactic, to a man who has turned companionship into a private ritual with the dead. The city outside keeps moving. Buses grind their gears. Radios hiss. In the upstairs rooms of 23 Cranley Gardens, the stillness is absolute. The first truth of this story arrives not with a scream, but with the quiet recognition that a killer has lived next door, shopping at the same corner store, nodding in the same stairwell, his crime sliding unnoticed into the plumbing of the everyday. Sometimes the loudest confession begins with a blocked drain. Before the smell, before the drain, before the headlines, there was just Dennis. A quiet man, polite to a fault, living alone in a modest flat at 23 Cranley Gardens, North London. He wore pressed shirts, polished his shoes, and kept his kitchen spotless. To his neighbors, he was ordinary, almost forgettable. The kind of man you might nod to in the stairwell and never think of again. By day, he worked for the government as a civil servant at the job center. He helped people find work, signed papers, and drank instant coffee from a chipped mug like everyone else. To coworkers, Dennis Nilsen was articulate, soft-spoken, maybe a little distant, but never unkind. They would never imagine that every evening he returned home to an apartment that carried the silence of the grave. He had grown up in Scotland, a lonely boy raised in the shadow of an absent father. His grandfather, the only figure he ever truly loved, died suddenly when Dennis was 6. The child wasn't told what death meant. He was simply led to the body, and that image still, pale, peaceful, rooted itself deep inside him. From that moment, death wasn't frightening. It was familiar, safe, and perhaps comforting. As he grew older, Dennis learned to hide behind politeness. The military shaped his posture. Civil service gave him purpose. But inside, there was a gnawing void, an ache that no friendship or fleeting connection could fill. He wanted someone who would never leave, someone who would stay, and when he discovered he could make that happen, that he could freeze time and hold on to a person forever, the line between affection and possession dissolved completely. In the late 1970 seconds, London was full of drifters and lost boys runaways, workers, young men looking for cheap rent or a night's shelter. The pubs around Soho and Camden were crowded with faces that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Dennis often went there after work, nursing a pint, watching. His demeanor drew no attention. He was friendly, a good listener, someone who seemed safe. When he invited a young man home, it didn't feel like danger. His apartment smelled of aftershave and tobacco, his tone soft, his hospitality genuine. He offered food, conversation, sometimes a place to sleep. The city outside was harsh and lonely. Inside his flat, it was warm. That contrast to comfort, before the horror was what made him invisible for so long. Neighbors remember the faint sound of a radio, old songs playing late into the night. Sometimes they saw the glow of a cigarette through the window, a silhouette pacing slowly across the room. No shouting, no noise, no hint that something unspeakable was happening just a few feet away. Dennis Nilsen blended perfectly into the rhythm of London life, a lonely man among millions. And yet, Beneath that still surface, a storm was quietly forming, one that would turn an ordinary flat into one of the darkest crime scenes in British history. It began quietly. No screams, no blood, just the sound of a chair scraping the floor in a small North London flat. It was 1978, and Dennis Nilsen had invited a young man named Stephen Holmes to his apartment after a night of drinking. They talked, laughed, shared stories. For the first time in years, Dennis felt the illusion of connection, the comfort of not being alone. But when morning came and the young man stirred, gathering his things to leave, Dennis felt something deeper than panic. It was terror, not of violence, but of abandonment. If I let him go, he thought, I'll be alone again. And so he didn't. He wrapped a tie around the boy's neck and pulled. It wasn't rage, it was desperation, cold and methodical. When it was over, Dennis sat beside the body for hours. He combed the hair. He spoke to it softly. And then, as dawn crept through the curtains, he realized something horrifying for the first time. The silence didn't hurt. He kept Stephen's body for several days. Ate dinner beside it, slept next to it, watched television while the corpse sat in the chair. It was as if he had finally found company that could never contradict him, never leave, never remind him of his loneliness. When decomposition began, he buried the body beneath the floorboards of his flat on Melrose Avenue. He visited it from time to time, lifting the floorboards just to look, just to feel that it was still there. To Dennis, death had become a pause button, a way to make love permanent. Over the next 5 years, he would repeat the ritual again and again. His victims were often men who had nowhere else to go, hitchhikers, drifters, young men who thought they'd found a friend. He killed them not out of hatred, but out of a warped need for control, for companionship that would never walk away. The method was always eerily similar. A night of drinking, a promise of warmth, a fatal moment when his guests turned into possessions. After each, Dennis would wash the bodies, dress them, pose them. Sometimes he would keep them for days, talking to them as though they were alive. Other times he photographed them, preserving the illusion that his victims were still with him. When his first flat became too full, he moved to 23 Cranley Gardens, a smaller apartment with no garden or soil to bury in. There, he found new ways to hide the evidence. He cut the bodies into pieces, boiled flesh to mask the smell, flushed remains down the toilet, and burned bones in the fireplace. And through it all, he went to work every morning, shaking hands, making tea, filling forms, while the air in his apartment grew thicker with decay. There's something profoundly chilling about how normal it all appeared. Neighbors never complained of noise, only a strange smell now and then, which he blamed on plumbing issues. Friends described him as calm, intelligent, a bit lonely perhaps. Even his landlord thought of him as reliable. He was living in two worlds, one of order, the other of obsession. Each blurred the line between them a little more. By the time 1983 arrived, the man who once feared loneliness had become its prisoner. And all it took to expose him was a blocked drain. It was a Thursday morning, February 9th, 1983. A maintenance worker named Michael Catran arrived at 23 Cranley Gardens to fix a persistent plumbing issue. The tenants had been complaining of a strange, foul smell and slow drainage. When Catran opened the access point to the shared drain, what he saw wasn't sewage, it was something pale, stringy, and unmistakably organic. He fished out a few pieces, wrapped them in tissue, and felt the chill that only comes when your brain knows the truth before you admit it. Later that day, he told his supervisor, "That's not from an animal. It looks human." They returned that night to investigate again, but the drain had been mysteriously cleared. Someone, it seemed, had noticed. The next morning, police knocked on the door of flat 23D. Dennis Nilsen opened it calmly, in his shirt and tie, as if expecting them. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the drains," one officer said. "You're not here about the drains," Dennis replied. That single line, quiet, steady, was the first crack in the facade. When detectives asked about the remains, he simply nodded. "It's a long story," he said softly. "And it goes back a long time." Within minutes, he confessed without resistance, without hesitation. "There are 15 or 16, he said. "Most at my old place, some here." The officers exchanged glances. Unsure they'd heard right, Dennis offered to take them through it all, step by step. His only request, a cigarette. When police searched his flat, the reality of those words settled like a fog. Inside the wardrobe, they found plastic bags filled with body parts. In the kitchen, a pot still held chunks of flesh. The smell of disinfectant mixed with decay hung thick in the air. Every surface was clean obsessively, so except for the stains that never truly wash away. Investigators described it as surreal. Nothing about the apartment screamed horror. There were books, neatly folded clothes, a small table with 2 chairs. It looked like a lonely man's home, until you looked closer. As forensics worked through the night, Dennis sat quietly in an interview room, chain-smoking, describing the murders in unsettling detail, not with pride, not even with remorse, but with the weary tone of someone explaining a habit. He spoke about his loneliness, his need for control, the comfort of keeping the dead near him. "I loved them in my own way," he told the officers. "They were mine, and then they were gone." He couldn't remember all their names, only faces, fragments, songs that played on the radio while he... Some victims were never identified. To him, they were ghosts that filled the silence. The discovery at Cranley Gardens triggered a nationwide shockwave. Reporters flooded London. Headlines screamed, "The Monster of Muswell Hill." But those who knew Dennis couldn't reconcile the word monster with the man they remembered, a polite colleague, a soft-spoken neighbor who fed stray cats and watered the shared garden. It was this contrast that chilled the public most. That evil could live so quietly, that horror could wear such an ordinary face. The investigation stretched for months, unearthing remains from his previous address on Melrose Avenue, bones beneath floorboards, ashes in the garden, personal belongings of the vanished. The count of victims reached 15. When asked why he killed, Dennis Nilsen gave no elaborate excuse. He simply said, "I couldn't stand being alone." A single sentence that turned the story from madness into tragedy, a reflection of what happens when loneliness curdles into something monstrous. And yet, beneath every calm word, the detective sensed something else, not guilt, but relief. For the first time in years, Dennis Nilsen had someone listening to him. The news broke like a storm. London awoke to headlines screaming, "Killer confesses to 15 murders," and the name Dennis Nilsen was suddenly everywhere. For months, his face stared back from every newspaper stand. The neat haircut, the glasses, the emotionless stare. The public demanded a monster. What they found was something colder, and emptiness behind polite eyes. When the trial opened in October 1983, the courtroom filled with reporters, psychologists, and families of the missing. Dennis walked in quietly, almost formally, nodding to the guards as though they were colleagues. He pleaded not guilty to murder, admitting to the killings but insisting his actions were not driven by intent to harm. That paradox confession without guilt set the tone for everything that followed. Prosecutors laid out the facts with surgical precision. 15 young men dead, strangulation, drowning, dismemberment, concealment, and in some cases, ritualized preservation of the corpses. A calm, deliberate pattern stretching over 5 years. They argued he was fully aware of what he was doing, that each murder was premeditated, methodical, and free of remorse. The defense countered with psychology. They called him a man trapped by loneliness, incapable of understanding his own compulsion, not a monster, but a mental case born from isolation. Experts testified about necrophilic tendencies, narcissism, and childhood trauma. The courtroom oscillated between fascination and disgust. At one point, Dennis himself took the stand. His voice was calm, articulate, and detached. He spoke not like a killer, but like a man giving a lecture about someone else's life. "I didn't want them to leave," he said. "When they were dead, they were mine, and in death, they never left me." It was chilling not because he sounded insane, but because he sounded sane. Measured, rational, cold. He described washing the bodies, dressing them, sitting them in armchairs, and talking to them as though they were still alive. He explained how the stench became part of his life, a reminder that they were still here. When the prosecutor asked if he felt regret, he paused, then said softly, "I wish I could have stopped, but there was nothing else to hold on to." The gallery fell silent. Outside, crowds gathered, chanting "Monster!" as the prison van arrived each day. But psychologists saw something else, a warning about the invisible epidemic of loneliness in urban life. One psychiatrist described him as a man who tried to build companionship out of death. The trial lasted 6 weeks. In November 1983, the jury found him guilty of 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. The sentence: Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 25 years. Dennis Nilsen accepted the verdict with a faint nod. No tears, no outburst, just the same quiet demeanor he had always shown. As he was led away, a reporter called out, "Dennis, do you have anything to say to the families?" He turned slightly and replied, "I'm glad it's over. I'm tired of being alone." The irony was unbearable. A man who killed to escape solitude would spend the rest of his life completely isolated. In prison, he became a strange figure of fascination. He wrote hundreds of pages of journals, reflecting on his crimes in the tone of a scholar dissecting his own psyche. He read philosophy, painted, and corresponded with criminologists curious about his mind. Even behind bars, he sought an audience, someone to listen. He died in 2018, still incarcerated, of natural causes. His body, like those he once possessed, was claimed by no one. After Dennis Nilsen's death in 2018, his story should have ended there, buried with the files, sealed behind prison walls. But it didn't, because what he left behind wasn't just a record of murder, it was a mirror. The building at 23 Cranley Gardens still stands. The pipes have been replaced, the walls repainted, the rooms rented to new tenants. Yet few locals ever look at that top floor window. At night, when the wind moves down Muswell Hill, it carries the kind of quiet that feels heavy as silence, that knows. Neighbors cross the street without realizing why. Taxi drivers avoid stopping there, and every so often, an old resident whispers, "That was where the man lived who flushed people away." It's not superstition, it's memory. Even decades later, criminologists, psychologists, and storytellers continue to ask the same question: how does an ordinary man become capable of such horror? Dennis Nilsen wasn't the type the world warned you about. He wasn't violent in public. He didn't scream, didn't boast, didn't stalk the streets. He invited people in. He offered warmth, food, kindness. He was the danger you didn't see coming, the kind that wears a gentle face and lives next door. That's what makes his story unforgettable. Not the number of victims, but the ordinariness of the mask he wore. In the end, his apartment was stripped bare. The floors replaced. The drains sterilized. But the real stain, the moral one, remained far beyond those walls. His case changed how British police handled missing persons, how society understood isolation, and how the media portrayed evil. He wasn't the monster from nightmares. He was something far more terrifying, a lonely man in a city full of people. Sometimes, one detective later said, evil doesn't break down your door, it just lives quietly next to it. Today, the story of Dennis Nilsen stands as a grim echo, a reminder that darkness rarely announces itself. It grows slowly, quietly, behind polite smiles and tidy apartments, until one day, it spills into the world through something as mundane as a blocked drain. The case forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that loneliness, left to rot, can become as deadly as any weapon.